I cannot believe in a God that is vague, or in a God that is incoherent. To know God, if there is a God, I'd want to know what God is like. I'd also expect God to make sense. Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, claim that God is a perfect being, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good. But because God is God, I cannot accept such all-embracing finality without challenge. God's power and goodness gets lots of attention, less so God's knowledge. God's knowing all, God's omniscience. Is omniscience a test of a theistic God? For God to be God, must God know everything? Does God know everything? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. What does it mean for God to know all, for God to know everything? Everything seems a simple word, everything. Yet it would have to include infinities of things to know, infinities without end, levels and nestings of infinities that go on forever. I sense that God's all-knowing may be multi-layered, one revelation inside another, like a Russian Matryoshka doll. Why is omniscience a test of a theistic God? Because if God knowing everything is an incoherent concept, then a theistic God, at least the traditional one, will be in trouble. I begin with a philosopher of religion and expert in discerning God's traits, Edward Wierenga. Ed, the God that I'm told exists is a God that is omniscient, meaning, supposedly, knowing everything. The more I think about that, the more that sounds, if not impossible, absolutely ridiculous.
Okay, so maybe what we should do is think about what omniscience means or requires or how to understand it. And the simple and straightforward definition is God's omniscient just in case he knows all true propositions. The idea of omniscience emerges in part from religious claims about God making promises that he knows he can keep and so on, or assurances from God about what will happen. But then it also emerges from reflection on, well, what would it be like to be completely perfect? And a being like that would have perfect knowledge. And perfect knowledge could well include knowledge of unpleasant things or boring things. Wouldn't that be demeaning? But I think it would be more deficient if he was unaware of things like that. I start with the idea that God knows every true proposition, and then maybe you might discover some propositions that knowledge of which isn't required to be omniscient.
But you don't believe it. You believe that God really does know every true proposition. Anything that you can state that God would know today is a true proposition, that God knows that for sure. Now, that would naturally lead to a discussion of the future. That assumes that knowledge of the future is a truth today, which is an arguable point.
Exactly right. That if there are true propositions about the future, and omniscience requires knowing all true propositions, then it's a consequence of that account that omniscience includes foreknowledge. The propositions about the future are not yet true, so if you thought that, that'd be a reason to say that omniscience is limited. That initial definition I think we ought to think of as innocent until we prove that it needs some revision. So part of omniscience is just knowing all truths. Part of what's involved in perfect knowledge is some other thing as well. It's something about the character or the quality of the knowledge. So for example, not merely does God happen to have his knowledge, but he couldn't make a mistake. He couldn't believe a proposition and have it be false. It's a kind of infallibility with respect to his knowledge. And there are also questions, I guess, about how he gets this knowledge. There's no satisfying answer as to how God gets his knowledge. It's got to be part of a full account of what perfect knowledge is like. Not only what's the extent of knowledge, but where does God get his knowledge? And it's hard to say. I mean, you have this idea that he's sort of peering ahead, looking into the future. And if the future hasn't happened yet, is there really something there to see or to peer into? There's an alternative that I favor, which is that God gets his knowledge by part of a plan that he develops in the first place. That he gets his knowledge because he's got providence allows him to make a whole plan for all of history, meaning that he has set things up in such a way that they happen according to how he wants them to go.
Well, it seems to me that there's great tension between the competing intuitions of God knowing literally everything, particularly about the future, and human free will. Which is the stronger intuition?
The simple argument is, if God knows ahead of time what you're going to do, then you've got to do it. Then you're not free with respect to doing it. That's kind of compelling, but as a lot of people over the years have noticed, the first premise is ambiguous between necessarily, if God knows you're going to do something, then you'll do it. The alternate reading of that first premise is, it's not the case that everything God knows, by the very fact that he knows it, is therefore the kind of thing that has to be true. What follows from his knowledge of it is that it is true, not that it must be or has to be or is necessarily true. If God's offer of salvation requires that he do something in the future, if he doesn't know what's going to happen later, how could we be so confident that he would end up in a position to do those things? That's part of what is required for him to be exercising providential control.
Ed defines God's knowing everything as knowing all true propositions. Fine, but then swiftly I'm drawn into the perennial tension between God knowing the future and human free will. To Ed, it is not that God's knowing things makes them happen. It's that things do happen and God knows them all. Does that make sense? Every time I think it does, an hour or so later, it doesn't. It's a philosophical quagmire. I need an expert on free will who can address the theological implications. I go quickly to philosopher Peter van Inwagen. Peter, to you, what does it mean for God to be omniscient?
Omniscience is simply that for every truth, God knows that truth. Of course, neither God nor anybody else can know something that's false. Knowledge implies truth. For most of us, there are true things we don't know, but not for God. If it's true, he knows it.
One of the areas that philosophers have come up with to solve a thorny problem of how God could know the future and at the same time allow real human freedom to exist is the so-called middle knowledge. And that is that God can know before the creation what every free creature would do freely, fully freely, in any circumstance. And therefore, God, in the creative act, would pick just that world that God wanted, but that every creature is freely acting. But God, from before creation, knows exactly what's going to happen.
Yes. And of course, this is exactly the knowledge that an omniscient being would have if there are such truths. Another possibility, of course, and it's certainly the one I favor, is that an omniscient being doesn't know these truths because there are no such truths to be known. There are no truths about what a free being would do if offered a free choice between two alternatives in circumstances that are never going to arise.
And why is there not a truth now of that matter?
Consider a situation that I'm not going to be in which a student, say, offers me $1 million to raise her grade from a B to an A. What would I do in those circumstances if it was a free choice? Why does there have to be any truth about what I would do? If it's true that what I would do is freely accept the bribe, then it must be that somehow a circumstance in which I'm offered the bribe and accept it is in some way closer to reality than one in which I'm offered the bribe and don't accept it. But if it's just undetermined, if the antecedent, if my being in those circumstances and the offer, those are the same, and then there's simply an indeterministic fork in the world, how can one fork be closer to reality than the other fork? There's just no basis in reality for the truth of one of those counterfactual conditionals.
And therefore, it doesn't impinge on God's omniscience not to know that these so-called counterfactuals of freedom.
Right, because according to the standard logic of counterfactuals. If I were offered the bribe, I would freely take it, and if I were offered the bribe, I would freely reject it, are both false. They can both be false. God, being omniscient, knows that. He knows that each one of them is false. He knows that also that one of them would be true if the antecedent were true, if those circumstances actually arose, but neither of them has the property of being the one that would be true. He knows that. He knows everything there is to know in this circumstance. This is a much more comfortable situation for me, and that's God's omniscience is not threatened simply because there's no such thing for him to know.
Peter defines omniscience simply. For every truth, God knows that truth. The problem arises with truth. Can what will be true in the future be taken as truth today? The challenge here is that with both kinds of solutions, I find trouble for God. If God cannot know all future truths, then God as a perfect being seems impaired. But if God can and does know all future truths, then what's the point in playing the movie? Certainly, no matter what classifies as truth, there are infinities of truths. How could even God know them all? I asked the Oxford professor of the philosophy of the Christian religion, an expert on the logic of God, Brian Leftow. Brian, I'm told that the God I should believe in has infinite knowledge. What does that mean? And is knowing everything the same as knowing infinite things?
That God knows everything implies that God knows infinite things, if there are infinite things to know. And I think there certainly are. There are an infinity of true propositions. There is a true proposition about what's going on at every point in space-time, and there are infinity of points. God knows what's going on at every point in space-time because he's contributing to its going on. If something exists there, he's causing it to exist there.
This stuff that God knows, these infinite things, are they present in his active consciousness, or it's something that God calls up and so he can figure out or recall something that's needed?
The perfect being theologian would say the best way to have your knowledge is to have it actively and presently possessed in your mind. And so if God has perfect knowledge, that's the way it is.
What is the mechanism, if we can ask that, how God could possibly know all possibilities?
He's the one who imagined them all. And then he decided which of the things he imagined was going to be possible and which ones wasn't. So he knows his own imagination and he knows his own decisions, and that's his access to the possible.
You said that God knows everything because God created all these possibilities. But if you're going to create everything, that's not a creative act. It's just that it's forced on you because you have to be totally exhaustive of every possibility. That's just going through a checklist.
What I'd want to say is that God determines what's on the checklist. His creativity is such that he determines what everything is going to comprise. The reason dogs are possible is that God thought them up, and that's the only reason they're possible.
But if there are possibilities are endless. I mean, if God didn't think it up, and there still could be possibilities. So I think God is constrained by having to just explode this thing on a continuing basis. It can't stop.
The only reason possibilities are endless, at least on my view, is that God made them endless. If he hadn't wanted them to be endless, they wouldn't be. Suppose that for some odd reason, he'd wanted dogs and cats to be the only possible kind of animal. He had the idea of giraffes and of human beings, but he just said those are going to be impossible.
Well, that's easy to do. Then he only actualizes what he wants to actualize. The question is, but he couldn't limit the possibilities that there weren't or would be giraffes. He couldn't decide that.
Once he thinks up dogs or cats, it is up to him whether they're going to be possible or not. God determines...
Think about what is possible?
Yeah. If he had wanted a cat to be an impossible animal, that's how it would have been.
Wow, that's a higher requirement.
And
to actualize them, to make them, that I understand. That's easy. But hard is to say he make them possible.
Let's ask the question, what is it for them to be possible? Some people say that to be possible is just to not have a contradiction involved in the idea. If that's right, then that's something that God determined because he was the one who thought up cats in such a way that there was no contradiction in the idea. I would say that to be genuinely possible is to be something that God might in some way permit to be actual. If that's true, then it's up to God what he decides as to what he might permit. So if you want to believe in a God who is providentially active in history and who can make things come out in the best way they can come out, you might want to hold that God knows everything.
To Brian, God knows everything because God creates and sustains everything at every point in space and time. Brian also argues that for God to be the most perfect being, God would have to keep all knowledge in God's active consciousness. Wow, all that clutter. I'm not convinced. I still think possibilities are a problem for God's omniscience. Because even if God didn't exist, possibilities, infinities of possibilities would still exist. So for God to know everything, God would face an infinitely large, infinitely swelling, infinitely monstrous tree of branching possibilities that even God could not stop. Are there more problems with God knowing everything? I ask a philosopher of religion who focuses on God's foreknowledge, David Hunt.
We distinguish in our own case between what we call occurrent beliefs and non-occurrent or dispositional beliefs. An occurrent belief is a belief that one is entertaining, that's fully conscious at that moment. So right now, I'm fully conscious of the belief that I'm sitting here in a chair, right? But most of my knowledge is not occurrent. It's not something I'm entertaining that I have in my consciousness right now. So that's what we call non-occurrent beliefs. They're also called dispositional beliefs because they can become occurrent under the right conditions. That is, we have a disposition to render them occurrent. Typically, I think divine beliefs, divine knowledge have been thought of as all occurrent. Certainly, God wouldn't have the problem I have of having all of his beliefs occurrent. So there's no problem there.
I'm not sure there's no problem, because if God is knowing everything, then God knows all kinds of tortures. You know, God knows all sorts of relationships that are meaningless. The angle between my two fingers now and as they change. I mean, who cares? So does God have to know all this nonsense?
That's a really good question to ask, because if you're going to want to motivate an alternative notion of divine omniscience, you need some kind of reason for, why maybe not all of God's beliefs are occurrent. And I think you've identified a pretty good one. Some people think, well, God's beliefs would all have to be occurrent because if some of them were non-occurrent, then he would be a lesser being than he would be if he held all occurrent beliefs. But I don't think that's entirely convincing. I mean, you might even argue that knowing, whatever he wants to know, whenever he wants to know it, that's a pretty impressive property. But you might be motivated to try another alternative by the existence of these various problems with divine omniscience. Maybe if some of God's or even all of God's beliefs are dispositional, some of those problems might be alleviated.
How does that benefit you in understanding God? Because if God's infinite, it could all be occurrent. What do you gain by having some of it be dispositional as opposed to fully conscious?
One problem that has to do with divine foreknowledge is how God would be able to remain an agent in the face of knowing how everything is going to go, including decisions he's going to make tomorrow. If God's knowledge of the future is largely dispositional, then that knowledge can't interfere with his agency. Only occurrent knowledge can interfere with one's agency. So it alleviates that problem to some degree.
David argues that God's omniscience is best achieved by God not holding the knowledge of all things in active consciousness. I start to agree, then start to worry. Am I anthropomorphizing God? Too much imagining God's mind as a big human mind? I worry because to know what God is like, and even to know whether God makes sense, I need to know if or how God knows everything. Philosophers and theologians often equate or even unify all of God's traits together. Yet God's knowledge seems especially fundamental, the foundation of God's awareness, the platform on which God's power and God's goodness are built. But suppose God is radically different from our theistic conceptions. What if God is not personal? I put the question of God's omniscience to a philosopher of religion who explores non-theistic or alternative gods, Yujin Nagasawa.
There are a number of arguments against God's omniscience. My favorite one is called the argument from knowledge d'essai. So suppose that I shop in a supermarket and I push a shopping cart, and then I find a trail of spilled sugar on the floor, and I wonder who is making this mess. And then I decide to follow the trail. And suddenly I realize that there is a hole in the bag of sugar in my own shopping cart. And then I realize that I am making the mess. And according to this argument, God cannot know what I know in knowing that I am making a mess. God can know that Yujin is making a mess, but he can never know what I know in knowing I am making the mess. This argument undermines God's omniscience. And moreover, it shows that the concept of omniscience is internally incoherent.
The argument against that says that you can only know everything of the things there are to know logically. God can't understand how a married bachelor can have an ice cream cone because a married bachelor is logically impossible. But God can know everything that can be known.
Yeah, so that's a possible response to this argument. So you might say that it is logically impossible for God to know what I know in knowing I'm making a mess because God is logically distinct from me. Mm-hmm. So it is a logically impossible task for God to perform, and maybe we don't need to worry about that. But what's funny about this argument is that I know what I know in knowing that I'm making a mess. Yeah. And obviously God doesn't know that. So I know something that God doesn't know, which you might find counterintuitive because God is meant to be omniscient. And the second argument, which is related to this argument, is what I call the argument from phenomenal knowledge. So there is something special about being me and being you and so on. And I know what it is like to be me, and you know what it is like to be you. And a bat knows what it is like to be a bat. And I can never know what it is like to be a bat because I'm not a bat, and a bat has a special sensory apparatus called sonar. And I can never know what it is like to use this sonar. And also there is something special about my own phenomenal or sensory experiences as well. And according to this argument, God cannot know what it is like to be me and what it is like to be you, and so on.
What follows from that?
One way of construing these arguments is to say that actually these arguments motivate the idea that we are parts of God. So according to pantheism, God is identical to the universe, and of course we are parts of the universe. So perhaps the pantheistic God can know what it is like to be me, or what I know in knowing that I am making a mess, and so on.
So a pantheistic God would now know something that a transcendent God would not.
That is correct, because according to classical theism, God is ontologically distinct from his creation. Right. So clearly, I'm not part of God. But according to pantheism, I'm a proper part of God because I'm a proper part of the universe, and the universe is a proper part of God.
So now, are there things that a pantheistic God cannot know that a theistic God can know? Whereas the pantheistic God is the universe, so can't imagine what it's like to create a universe.
Possibly the universe is a self-existent being. So in one sense, the pantheistic God knows what it is like to create the universe, even though the pantheistic God might not know what it is like to create the universe as the classical God.
Out of nothing.
Out of nothing, yeah.
What does it mean for God to know everything? The definition is easy. For every truth, God knows that truth. Then the trouble starts. Is God's knowledge of the future a truth? Can truths about the future be known? How could God know infinities of truths? Are possibilities truths? Must God keep all truths in God's active consciousness? If God's omniscience is essential for God being God, might that argue for an alternative concept of God, like pantheism? And if God does not know everything, particularly facts about the future, is it because existence erects an impenetrable barrier even for God, or because God self-limits God's own knowledge? For me, for now, God knowing everything oscillates between two extremes. Either the kinds of truths for God to know are limited and do not include truths about the future, or our concept of God is too human and must be altered, perhaps expanded radically, perhaps eliminated entirely. Figuring out what God knows gets us closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.